Hello everybody, by the time this video is out, it'll be Christmas Eve, so Merry Christmas, and or Happy Holidays. And in this video, I want to talk about a fairly Christmassy topic, because it involves snow and ice and things of that sort. We're going to be talking about the Ice School. So, Wizard101's Ice School kinda sucks, at least in PvE, and it's been this way for a long while. If you ask anyone, any time in the last decade, which school is the worst in PvE, they'll probably say Ice. So today, I'm going to go over what I think is wrong with the Ice School and my suggestions for improving it. Let's start off with probably the most notorious issue with Ice, Iceblade. The problem with this spell is that you do not receive it until level 38, almost 20 levels after the next latest, that being Life after the Croco Sphinx, when you're probably around, I don't know, level 18 or 20. And that is just an insane amount of time to wait for such a basic and fundamental buff. You'll probably almost be in Dragonspire by the time you get this, which means that questing through the first few worlds as an Ice is painstakingly slow to the point of being discouraging. It does make sense for tanky schools such as Ice to be a bit slower, but this is just ridiculous, and I'm genuinely surprised that in 17 years, KI has never changed this. And there's no reason they couldn't have changed this, because there is literally an open slot for an Ice spell. I kid you not, after completing Wizard City and going to Nightside, every school except Ice receives a spell. If you're an Ice there, you just don't get anything. Now, I'm not advocating for the tankiest school in the game to get both their Trap and Blade by the time they finish Wizard City. What I'm saying is that if KI wanted to switch some spells around, in terms of when you get them, they could. My personal suggestion would be to give Ice their Blade at level 18, where Ice Armor currently sits, and push Ice Armor to that post-Wizard City spot. This is still a little late because it's a tank school, but not egregiously late like it currently is. And that leads us nicely into the next issue with Ice. Absorbs, such as Ice Armor, suck. This is mainly because they do not scale with the progression of the game. As your enemies grow more offensively powerful, absorbs become less and less useful. Plus, they hardly felt useful in the first place. Why would I use all of my pips to prevent myself from taking about the same number of pips worth of damage? Assuming I gain pips at roughly the same rate as my enemy, all that does is make the battle take longer, whereas heals give you like double the value per pip of hits. It seems that in an attempt to fix this issue, KingsIsle added another absorb at a higher level with a higher value per pip, Frozen Armor. The thing with this is that because they are both per pip spells, Ice Armor is just objectively worse than Frozen Armor, and is completely 100% useless upon getting Frozen Armor. And Frozen Armor still isn't that good. Especially now with Archmastery existing, I'd much rather just heal. Also, why do drains just completely go through absorbs? No, like seriously, why? I don't understand that. I guess because death counters life, but I'm pretty sure Ice has more absorb spells than life. And nowadays, with Ice being a counter matchup to death, this makes even less sense. So needless to say, absorbs could use a rework. And to be honest, other than doing away with that drain stipulation, I'm not entirely sure how this should be done. My main idea would be to make absorbs take away from the base damage of incoming attacks, rather than the final calculated damage after stats and hanging effects have been accounted for. Kind of like an anti-damage enchant. This means that, assuming my enemy has 50% damage and I have 0 resist, if I cast an absorb for 300, and my enemy casts a Storm Shark for average damage, its base damage will go from 405 to only 105, and the final damage done to me with that 50% damage stat will be about 158. This is as opposed to the current system, where the 50% is added onto the 405 base damage first, which gets us to 608, then the absorb takes away from that, dealing 308 damage. So this makes absorbs significantly better, and scales better because the value of the absorb will essentially take away from the value of the incoming attack directly. For this, I think 125 per pip, something like that, is probably appropriate. The tankiest school can negate the DPP of the glass cannon school. It also makes sense for it to outpace damage slightly so that there's actually a reason to use it. But there's still the issue of ice armor being useless when you have frozen armor. To fix this, why don't we just make ice armor a set number of pips? 2 pips for 250 absorb, or 4 pips for 500, maybe a little bit more than that. Also, if you find this OP in PvP, then they can just be PvP banned. It's not like anyone's going to miss them. However, I can see an issue with this concept in that for it to take away from the base damage, it might need to be a hanging effect on the enemy and not on yourself, sort of like a weakness. And while I don't think that's necessarily an issue, I'm not sure that KI would be willing to change it that drastically, and a weakness-like effect doesn't really fit the term absorb, so, you know. Another idea could be making it scale with a certain stat. Maybe the absorb is worth more based on your resist, or your health, or incoming and outgoing, or maybe based on your opponent's damage. There's a lot of possibilities there. But honestly, absorbs are just kind of a flawed concept that I'm not sure are actually able to be balanced properly. Okay, so now that we've gotten those two relatively small things out of the way, let's discuss probably the most fundamental issue of the Ice Ghoul, which is the fact that their niche is just really not that useful. Tanking is rarely ever that necessary, to the point where you'd want an ice on your team, and healing is generally seen as more useful. And part of that is simply because for the majority of the game, enemies hit like twigs and are really stupid, but that's a topic for another video. So what can we do in the meantime? Well, let's think about Ice's actual ability to tank for the sake of the team. It's really not that good. Whereas Life has several spells that heal everyone, Ice really only has 1 or 2 that can efficiently protect everyone. Legion Shield and technically Shadow Sentinel, even though it's not explicitly an ice spell. And I think this shows the root of the problem for Ice. It usually only makes use of its tankiness for itself. It's not like your resist helps your teammates take less damage, so I think that Ice should have more spells that actually shift damage from teammates onto themselves. You know, like tanks are supposed to do. The best example of this is Shadow Sentinel, but again, not an ice spell. And there are also taunts. If you don't already know what these do, probably because they're pretty useless, they force enemies to target you instead of your teammates. Sounds perfect for this, right? Well, the reason that these are useless is because of the absolutely absurd cost for the value that you get. Taunt is 3 pips for 1 round of this. The enemies might not even hit in that time. Mega Taunt is 5 pips for 2 rounds. Again, just way too many pips for its utility. I think a much more appropriate valuing would put these at 2 pips and 3 pips respectively. If this is somehow too overpowered, they can always make certain bosses taunt immune, just like many are stun immune and or beguile immune. I will also suggest a new spell that, unlike the other 2 taunts, only Ice Wizards can train. This can fill the now empty level 38 spell slot. Protection, for 4 pips, would taunt for 2 rounds and reduce your incoming damage by 20% for those same 2 rounds. Although this works basically like an aura, it isn't one because with the way taunts work, if you cast it from first, it'll be delayed by a round. That and because this way it can't be removed. Anyway, this is essentially a mega taunt plus a brace for 4 pips. I think this would make Ice much more valuable in a team setting. Now this is kinda similar to Shadow Sentinel, but there are 2 main differences. 1. Intercept is a one-time utility. It redirects 50% of the damage of 1 incoming attack on each of your teammates to yourself. Protection shifts all incoming attacks to self over 2 rounds, which could be as many as 8 on 1 person if they're really unlucky somehow. All of those are going to you. And 2. Shadow Sentinel causes backlash. This does not. Plus, you get this way earlier and you don't need a shad. Another caveat to taunts I should mention is that they don't affect AoEs. And while I think it would be great if they did, I get the feeling that the reason they don't is because of spaghetti code, so I have doubts they could even implement this change. I don't mind this too much though, because this does give Shadow Sentinel more utility since that does work on AoEs. I will say the changes made to Shadow Sentinel in the Darkmoor update seem pretty good, but I think we can all agree that Ice still needs a little more. So now I'll briefly touch on stuns. Ice, along with Myth and sometimes Fire for some reason, is one of the schools that can use stuns, and stuns are largely pretty useless. They're outright banned in PvP, and pretty much banned in PvE because most bosses are stun immune. And I gotta agree with Kaiser Noah in that maybe not all bosses should be stun immune, and maybe instead it should be a certain chance. But also what you could do is you can make it so that if an enemy is stun immune, stuns will instead apply a 50% mantle, something like that. Other than that, I don't think there's a lot that can be done about it. And the last thing I'm going to suggest is a spell I call Cold Front. For 2 pips, you can sacrifice your shields for 2 powerful universal traps. The point of this spell is to incentivize you to shield and to actually give you a way to buff your teammates. However, this isn't exactly the ideal version of this spell, and if you want to see what I mean, well, I'll be talking about it along with 6 other spells in a video I'm making about Wisteria, so stay tuned for that. But anyway, that is another thing I think is lacking about Ice. Schools like Balance and Death can serve as solid tanks while also providing blades and traps for the team. Ice can't really do that. And while I don't think Ice should be made into a full-on support school, I think that if they're not gonna have any good buffs, then their tankiness should be seriously valuable the way Life's Healing is. There needs to be a good reason to have an Ice on your team the way there is to have a Life, a Balance, or a Death. And that's really what a lot of this boils down to. There needs to be more of a reason in general to have an Ice on your team. But yeah, that is all that I have for this video. If y'all have any other suggestions or comments about what I've said here, or questions, leave those down below and I will try to respond. Otherwise, I will see y'all next time.